All right, well, this is going to be part 4 of the identity of the Scarlet Harlot mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. I have gone through in detail in the last 3 videos explaining everything from the scriptures that the Lord showed me. So this is going to be part 4, which I had hoped to put in the last video, but my battery runs out, so I have to stop and charge that. Today I'm wearing this royal blue because I'm going to be talking about the ships and trade by ships on the ports of Israel. Many people probably do not realize that King Solomon, who was extremely wealthy with gold and silver and ivory and pearls and every delectable thing that you could eat, exotic animals, precious stones, everything was brought to Jerusalem because King Solomon hired Hiram of Tyre to build him a fleet that was his navy. Now, this was not necessarily a military navy, but this was something that he was a great merchant, and he was known by the phrase, trade follows the bride. So Solomon had all of these wives and concubines from all of these different nations because he believed that if he, let me just say, shacked up with them, that basically he could, work out deals to trade merchandise. So he was one of the great merchants of the earth. So you can probably tell where I'm going with this one. But let me just share some of the facts about King Solomon's ships. And one of the ports was Yam Suf, which is near the Red Sea. And let me get my information and I'll just start telling you the story. And hopefully I've got my constant comment tea with my clove in it with my clementine peel, my little cuties. So I love this, and here's to you. So let's start talking about King Solomon's trade with his fleet of ships via the sea. In 1 Kings 9:26, and King Solomon made a navy of ships on the shore of the Red Sea. Now when Solomon had finished building the wonderful temple at Jerusalem, he turned his attention to other parts of his dominions. He had learned much from the Phoenicians. He saw the wealth that they poured yearly into Tyre, and he felt that a navy for his own people would greatly tend to improve foreign trade and commerce. True, he had by his marriage with the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, improved the trade routes between the two countries of Egypt and Canaan, but the power of the sea was beginning to make itself felt throughout the eastern world, and Solomon appealed to Hiram for help. Now the Phoenicians had no port on the shores of the Red Sea, and very gladly Hiram seems to have thrown himself into the scheme for building a new navy for Solomon. To the chosen port, King Solomon traveled himself to arrange about the making of the fleet. The Giant's Backbone, as the port was called, was soon teeming with life and activity. Shipbuilders from Tyre and sailors from the land of Phoenicia were hard at work preparing the new ships until at last the great fleet was ready to sail forth. Guided by Phoenician pilots, manned by Phoenician sailors, Phoenicians and Israelites sailed forth together on their mysterious voyages into the southern seas. They sailed to India, to Arabia, and Somaliland, and they returned with their ships laden with gold and silver, with ivory and precious stones, with apes and peacocks. The amount of gold brought to Solomon by his navy was enormous. Silver was so abundant as to be thought nothing of in those days, and all the king's drinking cups and vessels were of wrought gold. And every 3 years his fleet returned with yet more and more gold and silver. For the first time, too, we can see the beginning of contact between the West and East. The kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents, sang the psalmist. This was from the West, from the Tarshish in Spain, already discovered by the Phoenician sailors, the Tarshish from whence pure silver flowed in glowing streams. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts, sang the psalmist again. This was from the east, from the shores of Arabia, from the yet more distant coasts of India, now opened up for the first time in history. Yea, all kings shall fall down before him, all nations shall serve him. So it was the Phoenicians that taught the Israelites how to obtain all this splendor and riches, insomuch as they taught them the value of the sea. Now, though the Phoenicians were the first pioneers of the sea, yet they did not neglect their homework. They excelled in bronze work and ivory carving. There are 2 bronze gates now to be seen in England, carved by these old Phoenicians. They are covered with groups of figures busy with all of the occupations of a seaport. Tyrian dyes, too, were renowned throughout the ancient world. Here is the old story of how they discovered the purple dye. Now, you know, the Romans used this Tyrian dye. It is kind of a combination of purple and scarlet, and this is what the Romans started using with their, Caesars and the rulers from Rome. So Israel was using the royal colors of purple and scarlet first. It was in the old days, so they said, that one day the nymph Tyros was walking by the seashore with Hercules, her beloved. Suddenly her dog broke a small shell with his teeth, and his mouth immediately became dyed with a brilliant red color. Tyros declared that unless Hercules would procure for her a robe of the same tint, he should see her face no more. Hercules gathered a number of the shells, and having dipped a garment in the blood of the shellfish, he presented it to Tyros, who was henceforth adorned with the royal purple, which throughout all ages has remained the royal color for British kings and princes. In mining, too, the Phoenicians were experts. They dug mines in Lebanon, their own mountains, then in the country now known as Rhodesia in South Africa. While Phoenicia was still at the height of her fame, Hiram, king of Tyre, died. And still today, in faraway Syria, a gray, weather-beaten tomb of unknown age, raised aloft on 3 rocky pillars, looks down from the hills above Tyre, looks over the city and over the sea beyond. It is pointed out by the natives to those who visit the once famous land of Phoenicia as the tomb of Hiram. Wow, I didn't even know they had his tomb. I think that's amazing. Solomon's overseas trading expeditions. That's in 1 Kings 9:26 through 28. In circa 947 BC, Solomon builds a fleet of ships at Ezion Geber on the Gulf of Aqaba. This is where King Solomon had the ships of his fleet at Ezion Geber, Aqaba. King Hiram of Tyre sends experienced sailors, and the expedition returns with great gold from Ophir, probably on the east coast of Africa, together with silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. See 1 Kings 10:22. Ships of Tarshish or Tarshish during the reign of King Solomon, which was circa 971 to 931 BC, the undoubted masters of the Mediterranean Sea were the Phoenician mariners from Tyre. In circa 947 BC, Solomon persuaded his ally, King Hiram of Tyre, to join him in mounting an exciting trading venture. Solomon built a new fleet of heavy cargo ships at Etzion Geber, modern-day Aqaba, near Eilat, on the Gulf of Aqaba, while Hiram sent experienced sailors from Tyre. After 3 years, the expedition returned, and fabulous riches, gold from Ophir, probably on the east coast of Africa, although I have my own opinions about where that is, together with silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. The island city of Tyre had been founded on the coast of what is now Lebanon by the Phoenicians as early as 2750 BC. The Phoenicians, like the Philistines, who settled further south on the coast of Palestine, were sea peoples who had sailed across from the islands of the Aegean and the southern coast of Anatolia to found new colonies on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. The heavy cargo ships sailing under the authority of the king of Tyre were referred to as ships of Tarshish. In circa 730 BC, the prophet Isaiah talks about the ships of Tarshish trading from the island fortress of Tyre. See Isaiah 23, 1 and 6. While the prophet Ezekiel also gives a graphic description of the ships of Tarshish being shipwrecked in a strong easterly gate at the merchants of Tyre, being ruined as a consequence, which is Ezekiel 27, 25 through 36. In circa 855 BC, King Jehoshaphat of Judah and King Ahaziah of Israel built a fleet of ships of Tarshish. The Hebrew expression is usually translated as trading ships. See 2 Chronicles 20, 36 through 37. And they show some Roman remains at Tarshish. In the story of Jonah, the reluctant prophet tried to escape from God by fleeing to the port of Joppa and boarding a ship bound for Tarshish in Jonah 1:3. This ship, too, was undoubtedly one of the many heavy cargo ships known as the ships of Tarshish, which carried grain from Egypt along the coast of Palestine to the city of Tyre and beyond, in Isaiah 23:3. So I'd like to share this ancient ships and art history, the navy of King Solomon and Israel, the ships of antiquity. One particular area of interest, which is central to the story of Solomon, was the fact that he was credited with having employed a large naval force in the conduct of his trade. In addition to having a navy, Solomon is credited with being a shrewd diplomat with alliances to the kingdoms of Sheba, Egypt, and Phoenicia, all of which were known to have had extensive seafaring capabilities at this time in ancient history. The Queen of Sheba alone was credited with having over 400 seafaring ships for conducting trade. Jewish history credits Solomon with having been successful in diplomacy and trade with the majority of his neighbors. A prime example of this diplomacy was mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 5, which relates his alliance with the ruler of Tyre, which was the chief seaport of the Phoenicians at the time. It was these key alliances in trade, diplomacy, and the ability to keep the peace that led to the apparent success of his administration. Other trading alliances credited to Solomon were with Kittim, Ophir, and Tarshish. Add to this list a list of countries from which Solomon took wives, and he can truly be said to have been a figure of international reputation. Israel was located at the crossroads of the Levant. The historic records from other contemporary cultures before and leading up to the time of Solomon show this geographic region to have been a very volatile area and was usually governed as a vassal state of one of the more prominent powers in the region. It is apparent from these records that the region had fallen into political turmoil after the onset of invasions by the Sea Peoples against Egypt in 1250 BCE. The early invasions, exploits of Merneptah, 1224 to 1210 BCE, against the Sea Peoples are recorded as relief murals at Karnak. The later invasions of the Sea Peoples that were repulsed during the rule of Ramses III and are recorded at Medinet Habu in graphic detail. Egypt's influence, political and military dominance, was not asserted again until the Palestinian campaign of Shishak I, following the reign of Solomon in 941 BCE. This was the same historic time frame in which the Hebrews colonized the Levant, according to the biblical account. The concept that Solomon had and maintained a naval force is key to understanding the success of his administration. Without understanding the extent to which sea trade affected the economy of the Eastern Mediterranean nations, it would be difficult to understand much at all about the foreign policy and diplomacy of Israel during this historic time frame. One of the most interesting stories that suggests the extent of travel and trade that occurred in the prehistoric era is the Milesian myth of the Irish. This myth is considered to be legend and falls outside of the classification of history, but the storyline intimates the extent to which travel, trade, and colonization may have occurred in the ancient world. One account of this story attributes Milesius to be the brother-in-law of Solomon. This would be the case if both were married to the daughters of the same Egyptian pharaoh, considering each had Egyptian wives. By the Milesian myth account, travel and trade occurred between the British Isles, the Spanish coast, the Mediterranean island nations, the coastal cities located in region of the Black Sea, and the eastern Mediterranean coastal cities, including the Egyptian Delta, as early as 1700 BCE. The Irish Milesians are not to be confused with the Miletian Greeks from Lydia. It is tempting to indulge in conjecture that though we do not have a reliable written record to verify this extensive travel did indeed occur, it is speculated that navigation was accomplished not in the open ocean, but primarily by short hops along and within view of coastlines. For merchant ships powered by sail, a daily sailing effort would have covered from 50 to 75 miles under good conditions. Travel and extended trade may have been more prevalent than previous conservative estimates suggest. The best archaeology confirming some of the extent of travel and trading patterns are the Old Buran Bronze Age shipwreck and shipwreck at Cape Gelidonia on the Turkish coast. Both cargoes suggest trading patterns that covered a wide territory, including parts of Africa and the Middle East. Written records verify trading patterns of the Egyptians, including travel through the Red Sea to sub-Sahara Africa as far as Somalia along the western coast as early as 2450 BCE. The fact that trade was conducted south makes it easy to speculate that similar length journeys would have been made into Mediterranean basin. The most adventuresome of estimates suggest that the African features found on sculptures in Mesoamerica are due to the fact that Africans did indeed arrive by sea in the Western Hemisphere as early as 1700 BCE. And you know, when you get to the book of Acts in the Bible and you start seeing the Apostle Paul, he was traveling across the Mediterranean to all of these ports, you know, that were all around the Mediterranean Sea, and even going to Rome. Considering the fact that the history of the Levant indicates that it was generally void of strong civil government from the time of the Exodus until the time of Solomon, the ability of his administration to maintain the peace, conduct adequate diplomacy for trade, and to guarantee the safety of his kingdom was nothing less than a formidable task. Archaeological clues along the coastal Levant strongly suggest that the city-states of coastal Levant were for many centuries trading outposts of the Cypro-Minoan and Mycenaean cultures. Solomon, according to the biblical accounts, had good relations with Hiram, the Phoenician ruler of Tyre, the foremost seafaring nation in the eastern Mediterranean, to the extent that this foreign king assisted Solomon in the creation of a naval force. This piqued my curiosity as to the likely appearance and structure of the naval forces of Solomon, and to find out what seafaring technologies were available at the time to put a naval force to sea. And, of course, they show Hatshepsut's naval vessels from the 15th century BCE. Saying that Solomon's naval capability may have been modeled after this type of ship. In 2 Chronicles chapter 9, the Bible, which is considered by many to be the primary record of Jewish history, clearly records the relationships in ancient history that Solomon's kingdom had with the seafaring nations of the eastern Mediterranean: Phoenicia, Sheba, Kittim, Tyre, Tarshish, Ophir, and Egypt were all seafaring nations and or trading partners of Israel. The entire chapter 9 of 2 Chronicles is a record of Solomon's political alliances for trade, determining the exact location of and the realm of influence of the individual trading partners during Solomon's time is a matter of conjecture and additional scholarship. So he was sending out this fleet to go get wealth: gold, silver, ivory, pearls, precious stones, etc. Tarshish is taken to the coastal area of Spain near current-day Seville and Cartagena. The Tarshish realm of influence would have included the islands of Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and Malta. It is interesting to note that Irish folklore does tell a story of ancient history, specifically the Milesian myth, which I mentioned in the other article, indicating trade occurred between Spain, the coastal cities of the Black Sea, the coastal Levant, the Egyptian Delta, and the British Isles. I have found strong similarities between Minoan artifacts found in Peloponnesian, and Irish burial tombs and mounds from the same chronographical periods. The Bible clearly indicates the princes of Tyre to be wealthy merchants controlling the sea trading routes in the eastern Mediterranean, including Tarsus, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and until the time of Solomon, Eldor, which is credited with becoming the primary seaport of Israel in the eastern Mediterranean during the reign of King Solomon. Phoenicia prospered as a trading nation until the time of the Assyrian conquest. At this time, it's recorded in the book of Isaiah that the Phoenicians fled in their boats to settle elsewhere. History shows us that they fled to the geographical area of Tunisia in northern Africa and established Carthage as their primary trading post. The biblical reference to Israel and King Solomon trading with the country of Ophir remains a little more shrouded in mystery. There are indicators in the Bible as to its possible location if you read the clues. It is mentioned that the voyages going to Ophir left the port cities in the Gulf of Aqaba and didn't return with their trade items until taking a round trip that lasted 3 years. The Bible also indicates that these journeys were a joint venture of Solomon and Hiram of Tyre. This story indicates that Phoenicia was already in trade with Ophir before Solomon struck his alliance with Hiram. Sheba, located on the southern Arabian Peninsula and its realm of influence, including the Horn of Africa. Sheba, based on its location, would have controlled the eastern and southern trade routes through the Red Sea. The Saba kingdom happened to control trade routes south of the Gulf of Aqaba, both overland and with ports on the Red Sea. Therefore, Saba would have controlled access to the eastern African coast, the Arabian Gulf, and India. The other indicator as to Ophir's location are the descriptions of contents of the cargoes coming from Ophir. Scriptures indicate that these cargoes contained ivory, apes, peacocks, algum trees, and spices. This description of the cargoes point to India as being Ophir, particularly the peacocks. The other indicator that Ophir may be in fact in India is the fact that the journeys to and from Ophir were said to take as long as 3 years, which indicates a very long distance travel route. Travel in open seas covering of distances of this kind were generally done during favorable weather conditions. The traders would have traveled during the seasons that best assured their safety at sea and gave them favorable winds for their primary direction of travel. But it could also be that it took 3 years because, they were logging the cedars of Lebanon for the temple to be built, and they would bring them from the forest of God in Lebanon, which I talk about in my book, and they would float them down the Mediterranean Sea to the port of Joppa, and that's where they would take the logs and lumber, and then they would, prepare to build the house of the Lord and, other buildings with the cedars of Lebanon. So he was gathering all this wealth. In 2 Chronicles 8:17, it says, "Then went Solomon to Ezion-Geber and to Elat on the seashore in the land of Edom." 2 Chronicles 8:18, "And Hiram sent him by his servant ships and servants that had knowledge of the sea. And they went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir and fetched thence 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon. Surely the islands look to me. In the lead are the ships of Tarshish, bringing your sons from afar with their silver and gold to honor the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he is endowed you with splendor." That's Isaiah 60, verse 9. In 2 Chronicles chapter 9, Solomon would have had access and knowledge of the seafaring technologies of the Phoenicians and Egyptians, and most likely used this knowledge and his political alliances to build ships in these classes. 1 Kings 9:26 through 27 says, "King Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, a port near Elat, in the land of Edom along the shore of the Red Sea." Second Chronicles 9:21 said, "The king had a fleet of trading ships of Tarshish, manned by the sailors sent by Hiram. Once every 3 years the ships returned, loaded with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks." So what I'm revealing more of to you is who is the Scarlet Harlot, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots in the book of Revelation. In 2 Samuel 1:24, it says, "Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold." Another version of that says, "You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel." So when Israel was taken captive to Babylon, This was written by the prophet Jeremiah in Lamentation 4:5. Those who once ate delicacies are destitute in the streets. Those brought up in royal purple now lie on ash heaps. So that was in Jerusalem. All right, so Daniel 11, verse 37 says, "Neither shall he regard the gods of his fathers, and neither the desire of women." That's not talking about homosexuality. That was a wrong interpretation. And the way that I see it is that he suppresses what women desire for their lives. And probably the most logical definition of this would be that women were prevented from reading the Torah. So they could not have the sacred books, just like in the movie Yentl, even though that was about the Talmud. But in ancient times, the women were not allowed to have the scriptures for themselves to read. So he is suppressing the desire of women to live their lives and to be able to study God's word. That's the way I see that. Because if it was saying something that he wouldn't desire women, it would just say those words. He will not desire women. But instead it's saying, and he shall not regard the desire of women. So whatever they want for their lives, reading God's word, they're not allowed to speak, they're not allowed to teach, they're not allowed to do anything. The men are overbearing and not letting the women freely have the word of God. And thank God the Lord Jesus freed us to be able to have equal access. Nor any God shall he regard, for he shall magnify himself above all, but in his place shall he honor the God of strongholds, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor, with gold and silver and with precious stones and costly things. And he shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, whom he shall acknowledge, shall increase glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for a price. 1 Kings 9, verse 10. And it came to pass at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Now Hiram, the king of Tyre, had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees, and with gold, according to all his desire. That then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. And Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they pleased him not. And he said, What cities are these which thou hast given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Cabul to this day. And Hiram sent to the king 60 talents of gold. So what I started to say, and I think I left off, was that it may have taken them 3 years, because if they had to log, they didn't have modern equipment, so it would have taken them a long time to cut down the trees for the logs and to be able to collect them and, put them on some sort of ship and to transport them to the coast where they would float them in the water. And then, of course, they probably had to mine the gold. So it could be that they went to a gold mine and, some of the workers that sailed with them as sailors also did, trying to get the gold out of the mines and silver. If they didn't already have it mined, they would have had to take some time to do all that. Okay, so in 1 Kings 10, it says in verse 9, Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighted in thee, to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he thee king to do judgment and justice. And that was Solomon. And this is the Queen of Sheba. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold and of spices, very great store, and precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And the navy also of Hiram, that brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir great plenty of almug trees and precious stones. And the king made of the almug trees pillars for the house of the Lord, and for the king's house, harps also, and psalteries for singers. There came no such almug trees, nor were seen unto this day. And you know, I talked a little bit about this in my book, but they don't really know what the almug tree was, but I think it may be the almond tree. So now the weight of gold, and that's my whole testimony. My book is called The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah, King of Israel. And I talk about the musical instruments in there and everything. But Solomon's riches, written in 1 Kings 10. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 606 talents of gold. Beside that he had of the merchantmen, and of the traffic of the spices of merchants, and of all the kings of Arabia, and of the governors of the country. And King Solomon made 200 shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into one shield. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 pounds of gold went into one shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with the best gold. And then it describes the throne. And all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon, for the king had at sea a navy at Tarshish. With the navy of Hiram, once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and wisdom, and all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And they brought every man his present, vessels of silver, vessels of gold, and garments, and armor, and spices, horses, mules, a rate, year by year. And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he bestowed in the cities for chariots, and with the king at Jerusalem. And the king made silver to be in Jerusalem as stones, and cedars made he to be as the sycamore trees, and that are in the vale for abundance. And Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt, and linen yarn. The king's merchants received the linen yarn at a price. And a chariot came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so for all the kings of the Hittites and for the kings of Syria did they bring them out by their means. Now it says, for other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Messiah Jesus. Now if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest. For the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet as by fire. Now here's what King David said in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 2. Now I have prepared with all my might for the house of my God, the gold for things to be made of gold, and the silver for things of silver, and the brass for things of brass, and the iron for things of iron, and wood for things of wood, onyx stones, and stones to be set, glistering stones, and of diverse colors, and all manner of precious stones, and marble stones in abundance. Moreover, because I've set my affection to the house of my God, I have of my own proper good of gold and silver, which I have given to the house of my God, over and above all that I have prepared for the holy house, even 3,000 talents of gold, of the gold of Ophir, and 7,000 talents of refined silver, to overlay the walls of the houses withal, the gold for things of gold, and the silver for things of silver, and for all manner of work to be made by the hands of artificers. And who then is willing to consecrate his service this day unto the Lord? Then the chief of the fathers and princes of the tribes of Israel, and the captains of thousands and hundreds, with the rulers of the king's work, offered willingly, and gave for the service of the house of God of gold 5,000 talents, and 10,000 drams, and of silver 10,000 talents, and of brass 18,000 talents, and 100,000 talents of iron. And they with whom precious stones were found gave them to the treasure of the house of the Lord by the hand of Jehiel the Gershonite. Then the people rejoiced, for that they offered willingly, because with perfect heart they offered willingly to the Lord. And David the king also rejoiced with great joy. I wanted you to hear that they had the precious stones. Then again in 2 Chronicles 32, starting in verse 26, notwithstanding Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord came not upon them in the days of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah had exceeding much riches and honor, and he made himself treasuries for silver and gold, and for precious stones, and for spices, and for shields, and for all manner of pleasant jewels. Storehouses also for the increase of corn, wine, and oil, and stalls for all manner of beasts, and coats, and for flocks. Moreover, he provided him cities and possessions of flocks and herds in abundance, for God had given him sustenance very much. This same Hezekiah also stopped the upper watercourse of Gihon, and brought it straight down to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all his works. Howbeit the business of the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, who sent unto him to inquire of the wonder that was done in the land, God left him to try him, that he might know all that was in his heart. 2 Samuel 12, verse 29 says, And David gathered all the people together, and went to Rabbah, and fought against it, and took it. And he took their king's crown from off his head, the weight whereof was a talent of gold, and the precious stones, and it was set on David's head. And he brought forth the spoil of the city in great abundance. And he brought forth the people that were therein, and put them under saws, and under harrows of iron, and under axes of iron, and made them pass through the brick kiln. And thus did he unto all the cities of the children of Ammon. So David and all the people returned unto Jerusalem. We also see a rendition of this in 1 Chronicles 20 in verse 1. And it came to pass that after the year was expired, at the time that the kings go out to battle, Joab led forth the power of the army, and wasted the country of the children of Ammon, and came and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried at Jerusalem, and Joab smote Rabbah and destroyed it. And David took the crown of their king from off his head, and found it to weigh a talent of gold, and there were precious stones in it, and it was set upon David's head. And he brought also exceeding much spoil out of the city. And he brought out the people that were in it, and cut them with saws, and with harrows of iron, and with axes. Even so dealt David with all the cities of the children of Ammon. And David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. After having seen everything I said about King Solomon and his navy fleet traveling the Mediterranean Sea to all the nations surrounding, and King David taking spoils from Rabbah and putting the crown on his head with precious stones, and all of the verses about the precious stones being brought to Jerusalem with the gold and silver and all kinds of precious wood and metals, and also the agriculture with bringing animals, horses from Egypt and chariots, everything they brought into Jerusalem. Now I want you to hear Revelation 18, the lament for Babylon, which is mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. For her sins are piled up as high as heaven, and God remembers her evil deeds. So this was something that happened. You have to think about that, because God remembers her evil deeds, and this was written here in the book of Revelation, not from the point of, from the time this was written in Revelation until now. This was something that was remembered by God back then. So this further proves that this was talking about Jerusalem, because she had played the scarlet harlot against the Lord. King Saul gave them scarlet garments to wear. We see this again in Lamentations, that she was clothed in scarlet and purple, and she had a cup in her hand, that she and Samaria had a cup, and they would both drink of this cup. So if God is remembering her evil deeds from back then, this cannot be referring to America. It cannot be referring to Rome. And I'm going to start at verse 9. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spices, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves, that is, human souls. And where did we see every one of these items? Was in Jerusalem. And the precious stones and pearls. Jerusalem, once so full of people, is now deserted. She who was once great among the nations now sits alone like a widow. Once the queen of all the earth, she is now a slave. So it said, she boasted in her heart in Revelation 18, I sit a queen and am no widow and will see no mourning. Therefore these plagues will overtake her in a single day, death and mourning and famine. She will be completely consumed by fire, for the Lord God who judges her is mighty. And the kings of the world who committed adultery with her and enjoyed her great luxury will mourn for her as they see the smoke rising from her charred remains. They will stand at a distance, terrified by her great torment. They will cry out, how terrible for you, O Babylon, you great city. In a single moment, God's judgment came on you. The merchants of the world will weep and mourn for her, for there is no one left to buy their goods. She bought great quantities of gold, silver, jewels, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, things made of fragrant thyine wood, ivory goods, and objects made of expensive wood and bronze, iron, and marble. She also bought cinnamon spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, wagons, and bodies, that is, human slaves. The fancy things you loved so much are gone, they cry. All of your luxuries and splendor are gone forever, never to be yours again. The merchants who became wealthy by selling her these things will stand at a distance, terrified by her great torment. They will weep and cry out, how terrible for that great city! She was clothed in the finest purple and scarlet linens, decked out with gold and precious stones and pearls. In a single moment, all the wealth of the city is gone. And all the captains of the merchant ships and their passengers and sailors and crews will stand at a distance. They will cry out as they watch the smoke ascend, and they will say, where is there another city as great as this? And they will weep and throw dust on their heads to show their grief, and they will cry out, how terrible for that great city! The ship owners became wealthy by transporting her great wealth on the seas. And this was Solomon's naval fleet, and it continued down through the kings of Judah, that they kept gaining this wealth and bringing it into Jerusalem. In a single moment, it is all gone. Rejoice over her fate, O heaven and people of God, and apostles and prophets. For at last God has judged her for your sakes. Now remember, she's the city that killed the prophets. These were the prophets of old in the Old Testament. And also, they went after the apostles, and I think it was James that was slain up there on the temple, on the platform. Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a huge millstone, and he threw it into the ocean and shouted, just like this, the great city Babylon will be thrown down with violence and will never be found again. The sound of harps, and they've already made the harps for the third temple, and they have the Levitical singers, flutes, and the trumpeters. And the trumpets will never be heard in you again. No craftsmen and no trades will ever be found in you again. And I showed you the Shephelah was the area, the mass of land that was called the Valley of the Craftsmen. So when it's saying no craftsmen and no trades will ever be found in you again, it's talking about the land of Israel where that was. The sound of the mill will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. So they're always lighting the Sabbath candles and the menorahs and all of that. The happy voices of brides and grooms will never be heard in you again. For your merchants were the greatest in the world, and you deceived the nations with your sorceries. So usually when it's talking about Israel, it's talking about Israel and Judah and their monarchy. And it refers to everyone else as the nations. So that's another clue that this is talking about Israel and Judah and their monarchy here, that you deceived the nations with your sorceries. In your streets flowed the blood of the prophets and of God's holy people, and the blood of people slaughtered all over the world. And we see in Lamentations 4:5 that verse that said, those who once ate delicacies are destitute in the streets, speaking of Jerusalem. Those brought up in royal purple now lie on ash heaps. And some of the versions, King James says, they that were brought up in scarlet embrace dunghills. There can be no doubt that the original sin that led to death took place there in Jerusalem, but people don't realize this, that this is where the curse of Adam and Eve took place. And this is where God had to send the Messiah to die for our sins, to reverse the curse of Adam in that place. So this, Daniel tells us that there were 4 beasts, and the 4 beasts were 4 kings. So with that, it tells us that a beast is a king, and I keep reiterating that so you get it in your mind very solidly, because we tend to see these pictures of these monsters, and so it makes us think something totally different. But if you're thinking about the ancient monarchy being revived, and then they continue on in their sin against the Lord by rejecting him as their king, placing another king upon that throne of David, then this sin continues. Now, I have said that, it says that the scarlet harlot, she sits on many waters. So when God dispersed Israel and Judah, they went into all these other nations, and all the other nations have the elements of Babylon in them. So we could say that the beast that comes up out of the abyss or the bottomless pit is the ancient monarchy that died. The hand was withered, the right eye was darkened, Zedekiah's eyes were blinded, and God is going to let the monarchy come back. Eventually, he comes down and reigns in Jerusalem. We have all of these elements of tainted Babylon, but the main one that started this whole thing was when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, and some of the people went eventually to Shinar, which is Babylon, and they tried to reach unto God from that point by building a tower and putting a temple on top of it. And this is basically what the Muslims are trying to do by going up in a tower and bellowing out a song. So that's basically a Babylonian thing. Then we've got Rome, which we know is the corrupt version of Christianity, and all of the abominations that she has. So it's really interesting that the first time the scarlet harlot that originated in Jerusalem was taken to Babylon into their captivity, and she's also, like God brought the harlot out into a harlot. And then the second time, the punishment for Israel and Judah was being taken by Rome, who also has the Roman Catholic religion that eventually that is also a harlot. So you've got these 3 harlots coming together, forming the end time one world religion through the Pope, through not only the Pope though, the rabbis of the Sanhedrin are orchestrating a lot of this. So it's coming back to Jerusalem, and God's going to put an end to all of that worldly Babylonian business. So I wanted to explain that because the original place where this harlotry started was in Jerusalem. And people don't realize that. They see Rome and they see Islam. Rome, they say, sits on 7 hills. Mecca, they say, sits on 7 hills. But did you know that Jerusalem is the city that sits on 7 hills? And I believe that the 10 kings that are not kings, but they receive power as kings, are going to be representative of the restored tribes of Israel, which is the 10 tribes that were lost, and then you have Judah and Benjamin. So the 10 that receive power, that give their power to the beast in 1 hour, I believe that will be representatives that are not kings, but they are given power through a king, an earthly king, to do whatever it is they're going to do. They're going to sign some document or whatever, and so they're going to come together with one mind, and they're going to have, because they believe that the king, the Messiah, is going to restore the tribes. And we see that they are restored when we look at the 144,000. And I have to say that my, the odometer in the car that tells you how far you've gone, I had 144,441 on there about 2 weeks ago. I thought that was strange. You have to think of this as that this is something that was shown to the prince of Judah, which was the prophet Daniel. This didn't have anything to do with Rome. This didn't have anything to do with the United States. This had to do with the monarchy and what the prophet Daniel was praying for, the restoration of the monarchy in Jerusalem, the restoration of the holy mountain of God. He was praying for the restoration of the temple, which had just been destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. And then again, later on, hundreds of years later, the Romans, and God allowed them to come in and be ruthless against his people because they were again playing the harlot against him. So it's going to happen again. And at the end of that time, you can see that Jesus comes down from heaven and restores everything and starts to reign as the eternal king. So I'm not saying that the 144,000 are those 10 toes or the 10 that receive power as kings for 1 hour with the beast, which is a king. This, I think, is going to be probably King Charles III. I'm just seeing everything lining up saying that, basically. And if they appoint 10 from each of the 10 tribes, then they will be the 10 toes. They will be the revived monarchy. So this is like the beast, the king. This is coming up out of the pit, out of the abyss. And it's being restored. And so you have to see that the whole thing started in Jerusalem with the Garden of Eden. And so God is ending it there in Jerusalem in the place of the Garden of Eden. And that's where, I'm not saying that there's not going to be a righteous remnant coming out of Israel and Judah and in the tribes and all of that. Because God clearly says that he will be their God and they will be his people, but he's expecting them to follow his laws and his commandments. And most of them there are atheist or agnostic, and they couldn't care less about, believing in God, which is really sad. So you see that the whole thing had to do with the monarchy and the restoration, and Daniel prayed that God's divine presence would return there. So that's what's going to happen at the very end. But Israel has to go through this prophesied time of the 7 years of Jacob's trouble. And it's during that time that the wrath is poured out because, they're making God mad. They're bringing in all of these idols from all of these false religions and everything. So I hope I explained all this, and I hope you see from this that Jerusalem is without a doubt the original scarlet harlot. And this is where Adam and Eve sinned, and the Messiah came, reversed the curse, and then he's going to return at the end of Jacob's trouble. And those who already believe in the King, we're going to be taken up to be where he is. And that's called the rapture. Anyway, this is a lot of information. This is part 4. Please watch the first 3. And this is going to be, I think, the last one, unless I see something else or think of something else. So I hope you enjoyed all this information and found it worth your time. And remember, and I want to repeat this because I keep seeing people posting this and it's not accurate. The scripture says that one of its heads was wounded as if to death by a sword and yet lived. So the deadly wound in the head, as I've said 1,000,000 times, the king is the head of state, and this is the ancient monarchy of Israel, Judah, that received the wound in the head. But now they've been restored, and it's like they're brought up from resurrection to life, and everything's working out in God's plan. Now, a lot of this hasn't happened yet, so it's progressing and developing as we speak. So don't expect that everything in prophecy has already happened and that's it, because it's Daniel's prophecy was meant to only be seen in the last days. So everything that people interpreted over the centuries is not the end of the story, because those books needed to be opened to our understanding, and they are right now before your eyes. I truly believe this. And I've tried to show you every single scripture, and people only watch one video and then they make these assumptions that are off base, that aren't even part of what I'm trying to say. So hopefully I've been clear, and hopefully this really opens people's minds to the truth. And with this knowledge, we can now understand what's going to happen, because the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem plans to have everybody be under their Noahide laws, and we know that that involves a rejection of Jesus, which is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So there's going to be a punishment for that. And it's all up to God. It's his decision. He's dealt with his people over the centuries. But like I said in that one verse, it said in Revelation 18, God had remembered all of her iniquities. And so it's got to be talking about his people. That's why he said, "Come out of her, my people, lest you be partakers of her plagues." He's talking about Israel and Judah in Jerusalem, and that corrupt monarchy that was evil and fattened themselves with luxuries and all kinds of precious stones, silver, gold, wood, everything, incense, animals. So I've about covered it, I think. I hope that you understand. And anyway, I want to get this video up. This is the second day I've been working on this one. So for now, I'll say thank you for watching. Please support my channel. I really need support, and this is my work, and I put my all into my book, my life's work. So I just pray it blesses everyone. Have a great afternoon. Shalom.